The Fey creatures of Dungeons & Dragons are an extremely wide-ranging lot, as diverse a people as any of the races of the material planes. Collectively known as the Fey, these beings range from dryads to redcaps to hags to pixies to goblins. What really binds the Fey together is two things. The first being they're from the alternate plane known as the Fey Wilds, the other side of the coin, sort of, to the material plane. The second thing is Fey are magical creatures that are closely tied to the forces of nature, or in some cases, concepts or emotions. Their home, the Feywild, is a place of vibrant life where colors, scents, and other sensory input really can only be called extreme. The glow of the sun is brighter. The cold winds bite deeper. The flowers smell better. The mud is wetter? Muddier? So connected to nature as they are, the Fae themselves can and often are just as extreme embodiments of that nature, or emotion. Those Fae that embody an emotion often are that emotion personified. A joy Fae could laugh during the most horrific situation, while a fearful Fae spreads terror even during the happiest of circumstances. I say often embody that emotion because not all Fae whose energies are tied to emotions focus on embodying that emotion, but instead learn to manipulate it. Perhaps even harness it. The Ghost Fae, the Happiness Eater, the Emotional Vampire. Let's talk about the Joystealer. So, what are we going to be covering? In this episode, first we're going to talk about what a Joystealer is. Next, we'll dive into its origins or try to figure out the possible origins for the Joystealer. After that, we'll explore how I rebuilt the Joystealer for the 2024 edition of D&D and how they fare in combat. We'll close out then with some ideas about how to add the Joystealer not only as a monster of the week, but as part of an ongoing campaign. The Joystealers came to us in the Monster Manual 4 of 3rd edition back in 2006, but we haven't seen them since. Yes, they look like Fae, act like Fae, and can be just as monstrous as the Fae, but Joystealers are missing one key ingredient of being a Fae. The Joystealers aren't of the Feywilds. At least, not anymore. Originally calling themselves the Ensorrel, the Joystealers are amongst the Fae that are connected to emotions and not nature. As you can imagine, that emotion was, you guessed it, joy. When mortal civilization pushed at the boundaries of the wilds, most of the nature-bound Fae retreated further into the wilds just to get away. The Ensorrel instead stuck around, finding mortals a better food source than their fellow Fae. I think of this as the emotions of the Fae being delicious, ripe fruit from a prickly plant. Delicious, but always the same taste, and sometimes you get stuck on those thorns. Mortals, on the other hand, I think more like pizza, a whole bunch of ingredients cooked together that can range in taste depending on the toppings. Now, the Ensorrel didn't see the stealing of emotions as something that was evil. Instead, they saw their feedings as draining excess emotions that could only lead to conflict or pain. Indeed, the Ensorrel felt that their feeding was a necessary part of nature and were proud of their part keeping emotions of the mortals under control. Which sounds sort of noble until you realize they saw their feeding as being on a higher plane, a higher level than hunting or farming. Which, right there, is that familiar Fae attitude we all know and love, especially when you realize that the Ensorrel counted themselves amongst the unseelie. Since it's not a term used in 5th edition, if you don't know, the unseelie are malevolent sprites and creatures who enjoy harming others. Basically, it's how one might say a fae is evil, an evil fae. However, this outlook on their feedings does imply their feeding method might in the past have been less extreme than its current form. Perhaps the victims were able to eventually regain their capacity to have emotions again, unlike today. For these in sorrow are not the Joystealers of today. Instead, thanks to their horrific past, the Joystealers are now bound to the ethereal plane instead of the Feywild, forced to feed from mortal races of the material planes. To fulfill their hunger for feelings and passions, Joystealers haunt places of civilization, looking for victims. These victims are drained of emotions permanently. But the Joystealer experiences those emotions, but for a mere moment, they are able to revel in the joys of that stolen passion. I really want to make it clear before we get into the Joystealer history, the victims of a Joystealer lose the ability to feel emotions, any emotions, anymore after the feeding. They become emotionless husks after the attack. I would liken the Joystealers to energy vampires, needing to feed on emotions to exist and leaving their victims drained and unable to feel anymore. Perhaps calling them ghosts actually would be more apt, since Joystealers are now intangible monsters, stealing life from the living and are the only thing that remains of their former existence. All of this thanks to the Ethergaunts. Any discussion of the Joystealers has to include the Ethergaunts, because fundamentally, the Joystealers of today would not exist were it not for them. Also from 3rd edition, and specifically from the Fiend Folio book, Ethergaunts once lived on the material plane before departing to the ethereal plane in order to learn more about the universe. Following the trope of being corrupted by dark knowledge, the Ethergaunts became horrible, once humanoid monstrosities with a dash of ancient mysterious civilization who vanished long ago. You know, that old chestnut. While they did learn a great deal about how the multiverse worked, this knowledge, combined with being in the ethereal for so long, warped the Ethergaunts into aberrations. A second old chestnut, the Ethergaunts now really hate the inhabitants of the material plane and want them all dead. Why exactly is left up to DMs, but I get the impression it's like coming back from vacation and seeing rats, raccoons, and other vermin in your house, infesting every room. The problem is that the Ethergaunts aren't part of the material plane anymore. Post becoming aberrations, the Ethergaunts dwell in the ethereal plane much like a ghost. And, much like a ghost, they can perceive but not truly affect creatures and objects on the material plane. Sort of. With their material jaunt ability, an Ethergaunt can transport itself from the ethereal plane to the material plane for a limited time period before it gets forcibly pulled back. And it just can't spam that ability over and over again, so it has a limited amount of time that it can actually affect the material plane. Only magic like plane shift can allow an Ethergaunt to remain in the material realm for longer than a few moments, but even then, they still get pulled back. Not really long enough to get rid of those pests. Like I said, it's a problem. As much as the Ethergaunts hate life in the material realm, that doesn't mean they won't just use them. As a whole, each Ethergaunt is fully capable of enthralling or enslaving others via their enslavability, which acts like a dominate monster spell, But here's the important part: the ethereal gaunt's control is broken only by their death of either the ethereal gaunt or the enslaved creature. That's it. Of course, besides like magically granted freedom, dispel magic, something along those lines. But for the most part, there's no time limit. It just requires the death of one of them. And it's not a spell either. They can just do it at will a few times a day. Although it's never specified in the description, it sort of feels like a far realm influence on the ethereal gods. They got it from experiencing, in one shape or form, the far realm. The ether gods really as a whole have a vibe of creatures that have learned too much capital T truth, which is very much in keeping with the far realm, likely traveling so far in the ethereal realm that they reached maybe just the edges of the far realm, and that's where they learned a lot. Also, likely where their bodies were mutated or at least changed into their current form. The things they learned, I believe, include how to mind control people, which is what happened to the Ensorel, and then far, far worse. When the Ethergaunt decided on their extermination of the mortals, they looked for slaves that would be useful to their, quote, cause of emotional purification and physical eradication. The physical eradication, well, that just makes perfect sense. Gotta stomp out those vermin after all. The emotional purification, that's an interesting bit. In a lot of stories that are cosmic horror in nature, the more you learn about the Eldritch truth, the more you become detached from humanity and human emotions. The ethereal gaunts, the black ethereal gaunts to be very specific, have become incredibly intelligent thanks to their journeys of discovery in the ethereal plane. With them learning Eldritch truths, either in the form of the far realm or, getting up to it, however they learned it, it makes sense that the ethereal gaunts have become emotionally detached. Given that they see emotional purification as a worthy goal, the ethereal gaunts likely went as far as purging all emotions from themselves first. There is in fact an entry in the Joystealers that the Joystealers' ability to drain emotions had no effect on the ethereal gaunts' quote-unquote perfected minds, which to me really seals the deal on this aspect. Now, about those pesky mortal emotions. If you're looking for emotional purification, then really, the Ensorel, they're really kind of perfect. They literally drain mortals of their emotions. Yeah, those emotions did come back, but hey, that can be fixed. It's said, once they discovered the Joystealers, the Black Ethergaunts began to amass large armies of the dominated Joystealers until the entire race of Fae served them. However, there is one problem with the Ethergaunt's enslavability. There's a limit on how many dominating monsters an Ethergaunt can have at once. Well, that won't do at all to raise an army of emotional draining monsters, because you're gonna need an army because there are just so many so many mortals on the material plane. Thanks to their vast eldritch knowledge, the Ethergaunts had the technology and the know-how to permanently improve the Joystealers into a form more useful and less mortal plane-bound. With potent magic and technology that might as well be magic, the Ethergaunts fundamentally changed the Joystealers. My theory on how the Ethergaunts changed the Joystealers was by binding them to the ethereal plane. Fey creatures have a deep, inherent connection to the Feywild, even if they're not always physically bound to it. The Ensorel certainly weren't bound to the Feywild since they fed off mortals on the material plane, and that's really where they spent most of their time. The thing is that it's the nature of the Fae that they are tied to whatever they're bound to, whatever they represent, or promises they made. In the Ensoro case, joy. In D&D, the ethereal plane is a realm of fleeting thought, dreams, and emotions. It's an echo of the material plane, a realm of memory and ghosts. What the ethereal gods did to the Ensoro was exploit their Fey nature, binding them to an echo of the material plane and then letting their Fey nature take its course. Once bound, the Ensoro became echoes of what they once were. They became permanently hungry, any emotions they had quickly draining away, any emotions they drained also quickly draining away, fading like an echo in them so they could never become sated. They could barely feel the tiniest expression of the emotion that they drained, and thus are forever bound to keep draining just to feel that little flicker of emotion. Like an addict trying to get their next fix. Or, probably more accurately, a starving man trying to get their next meal of crumbs. Finally, the Ensoro have been bound to the ethereal plane for so long it's turned them ghost-like, insubstantial. Thus was born the modern Joystealer. And then came the escape. It's specified several times in the Joystealer's entry that they escaped their enslavement. Not just a handful of them, but it reads like the vast majority of the Joystealers are free. How they could have escaped is only actually mentioned in the Joystealers in Eberron part of their monster entry. Eberron being, for those unaware, another D&D campaign setting like the Forgotten Realms, focusing on high magic, technology, and old school pulp adventure feel. The basic Joystealer history is here. The Ethergaunts took refuge on the ethereal plane a long time ago. Joystealers fed on emotions, and the Ethergaunts thought that was pretty neat and began to collect the Joystealers. Where the story goes is that there was a big war across the main continent that included a theocracy. The Ethergaunts were using this war as cover for their efforts to wipe out the mortals, including using the Joystealers. Well, apparently the fever, the passions of the zealots of the theocracy were so great that the Joystealers were able to make their escape. Well, apparently the fever and the passions of those zealots of the theocracy were so great that the Joystealers were able to make their escape. Perhaps by getting enough emotional energy, like downing a lot of energy drinks, they were able to make a lot of will saves en masse, and then were able to make their escape in the chaos of the war before the Ethergaunts could try to dominate them all again. One or two escapees they could handle, but the Ethergaunts' nature, plus trying to, keep to the shadows so not everyone knows that they're trying to, destroy everything, left them being unable to really recapture the Joystealers. Thus, the Joystealers got out in the world free. Even on other worlds, other campaign settings with the Joystealers, the overall theory is sound. Most campaign settings have a war or two that could fill in for something similar, or, for a non-war idea, a powerful religious figure that inspires such passion in their followers. Basically, the Joystealers fed on a massive source of positive energy, positive emotion, which was enough for them to be able to break their chains and escape. Passion being that emotion makes a lot of sense. You can imagine in their servitude, that left the Joystealers passionless creatures. A sudden spike in passion might be the push needed for them to break their bonds. Not that all that passion helped the Joystealers' outlook on life that much, though. Freed from their servitude, the Joystealers can really be summed up as it's all about themselves. Under the subjugation of the Ethergaunts, they don't even try to pretend that the idea of draining away the emotions of others is in any way noble, not like they used to. Especially since now that emotion draining is far more permanent. So long as they can get fed, that's all that matters to the Joystealers. As before, Joystealers still hunt from the streets of cities and other places of civilization at the edges of that civilization. Their victims tend to be from slums and the like, affecting people that most don't care about, sadly for that exact reason. Interestingly, it's noted that individual Joystealers will seduce mortals with words and deeds, often trying to incite love or happiness, which they find pretty tasty with just a little touch of surprise and fear at the end. With their cruel streak, I can see a Joystealer finding some lost orphan on the streets and befriending them. Joystealers can even be sort of an imaginary friend, even protecting the orphan by feeding on their bullies. Building up that orphan, but with a sense of happiness, like they found a friend that they can really depend on. All the more bitter for when the Joystealer leaves them an emotionless husk. Friendless once more. The Joystealer, after all, has another victim to feed upon. As a CR5 Fae, Joystealers I find straddle the line between a ghost and a Fae mechanically, which I find really fitting. Defensively, a Joystealer's AC and hit points are pretty average for their CR. Since they are caught in between, the ethereal and the material plane, a lot like a ghost, I gave the Joystealers the resistances and immunities of a ghost. Damage-wise, they are resistant to the weapon damage types, bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing, a lot like a ghost. As for conditions, they have all the ghost condition immunities, save for poisoned, since they aren't dead technically. I also like the idea of people thinking they were ghosts and then getting real confused when they successfully poison one. I also got rid of the exhaust condition immunity for the same exact reason. They aren't dead. Charmed and frightened makes sense as immunities since Joystealers struggle to have emotions. So immunity to conditions that directly tie to emotions seems really fitting to me. I don't do this for a lot of monsters, but I gave the Joystealers some skill proficiencies. Being a race once so closely tied to and needing to interact with civilization, a few skills like deception, persuasion, and stealth seem fitting. Deception I added because they stalk and occasionally woo their victims, same with persuasion. Perception made it on the list because Joystealers were noted to be hunters. They stalk their prey, so in order to stalk your prey, you need to be able to see them. Which is similar justification I've had for adding survival, but more in the terms of actually hunting down their victims. In terms of traits, etherealness is just common sense to me, given it's a ghost. It's like a ghost. It exists on both sides. Same thing with ethereal sight as a nice ribbon feature. It allows it to, see on both sides. In keeping with that, Joystealers still have incorporeal movement, giving them a lot of movement options, as well as a lot of escape options once they drain those emotions away. Finally, as the cherry on top, Joystealers have sense emotions, which allows them to hunt down mortals to feed upon. Speaking of which, on the attack, Joystealers use their Draining Touch action not only to do damage, but more importantly, drain a target's charisma score, similar in the way that a shadow drains strength. Ability score drain is nothing to sniff at in 5th edition, And for classes that don't use charisma, it's likely going to be their dump stat, meaning it's low, and easily drop to a minimum. Note there is no specification that a creature dies when the score hits 0. In fact, per the rules, if an effect reduces an ability score to 0, that effect explains what happens. For example, shadows have text saying that the target dies if their strength is reduced to 0. For the Joystealer, when the target gets their charisma score reduced to 0, they become incapacitated, which is perfect for the Joystealer, as its main goal is not to kill its victims. It just needs them weak enough for its second ability, Drain Emotions. The star of the show is the Joystealer's Drain Emotion ability. Targeting a creature within 30 feet, Drain Emotions is a charisma saving throw made even harder if you're incapacitated. Given that the Joystealer should be draining that ability score away, and the target ideally should be incapacitated, the target should fail the save pretty easily, and thus become cursed to have no emotions. The 3.5 Drain Emotions basically said the target can't be affected by any morale bonuses or penalties, can't rage, and can't receive any benefits from any other ability derived from inspiration or emotions. To me, it was very much written needing the DM to make judgment calls, particularly on spells. Which spells might actually be considered emotions, like they affect emotions? To make it more clear and easy to figure out, I first decided to go with making the effect a curse. This is exactly what curses are for, a specific effect, and they're hard to get rid of or impossible to get rid of without magic. For my take on Drain Emotions, the cursed creature becomes immune to the 2 emotion-based conditions, charmed and frightened. You cannot be swayed and you cannot be frightened. A minor benefit in theory, if you want to look at it that way. The Joystealer even gets a mechanical perk of gaining a few temporary hit points as they drain away that emotion, to represent a bit of a boost that they get when they drain the emotion, which is appropriate because, those emotions that they get are temporary, and so are the hit points. However, that's not everything. Let me tell you, Drain Emotions actually was pretty hard to convert. The immunity to those 2 conditions, that can't be enough. The original 3.5 description of Drain Emotions does a lot in terms of what it means to have one's emotions drained. A lot of what it talks about is hard to do in 5th edition. For example, in 3.5, it mentions that it prevents rage and bardic inspiration, but I don't like hard shutdowns of class features. Morale bonuses don't exist in 5th edition. I thought about preventing a target from gaining advantage, but that seems like a little too much from a, CR5 creature. Especially on an ability that really can't be removed easily. It also is a hard counter to rogues who then no longer have their easiest method to perform sneak attacks. I do overall make one exception to my hard shutdown rule: spellcasting, because spellcasters sometimes, need to be put in their place. With that, that's actually where I decided to go with, okay, what are actually emotion spells in the game, especially, 5th edition emotion spells. I went through all the spells that could have anything to do with emotions, looking for an easily common factor that I could prevent, and realized a lot of the spells that I would call emotion, morale, or inspiration based mostly fell under the enchantment school. Bless and Bane, classic buff spells, are enchantment spells. as are calm emotions, the charm spells, confusion, crown of madness, suggestion, vicious mockery, zone of truth, and the dominate spells. For the most part, in the 2024 edition of D&D, enchantment spells seem to fit the bill as effects that are emotion-based, morale-based, or inspiration-based. Now, there are a few standout spells that don't really fit, such as like Hex. Hex is weird, and so is Modified Memory, let alone the power words, but I think you can justify all of them to one degree or another. The power words don't affect those that can't feel the gravity of the words. They don't have the emotion, the emotional capability to really understand the weight of those words. Modified memory doesn't work as the lack of emotional attachment to memories keeps them static and unchanging. The curse of Hex can't overpower the curse of drained emotions. After rationalizing all of that and just kind of going through all the enchantment spells, it really was easy to say that the target was immune to the effects of enchantment spells. Finally, this curse can only be removed by destroying the Joystealer that caused it, or the remove curse spell. When it comes to combat, it's important to know why a creature would fight, and frankly, Joystealers don't want to fight. What they want to do is get the jump on a target, drain them of emotions, and then get out of there. One thing that I like is that the Joystealers are noted to work together in groups to ambush their prey, which I think is the best way, the only way to really use them in a fight. One will run. A pack, however, will fight, at least for a little bit. With a party of 4 level 6 adventurers at a medium difficulty, that's about 2 Joystealers plus a few extra XP for like a random Fey Beast if you want to have that alongside them. This group of Joystealers begins an attack from ambush, hiding on, the other side of a solid wall or from the shadows thanks to their, decent stealth skill. When initiative is rolled and the Joystealers fail to win it, I think they just get out of there, because, they can always try again later. They don't want to fight if they can help it, and it's better to try again later. If they do win, I think they all go after a single target. I think the Joystealers just drain all the charisma out of one creature as soon as possible, that way they can feed on it. And then they move on to the next one and the next one, while one of them is, draining the emotions of the one that has low charisma or is incapacitated, while the others start to work on another target. These fights won't last long, even if the Joystealers do successfully ambush and really get the jump on the party. The goal is not to kill, the goal is to drain. There is no need to risk themselves. Cast Etherealness and be gone, or fly away and be gone. Go running through walls, be gone. The party, especially those cursed, would love for those Joystealers to stick around, and they won't. They're going to run. So the party's going to have to risk themselves to go after those Joystealers to kill the one that, cursed their friend. Or maybe they're high level enough that they can cast the remove curse or get it paid to get it removed. Either way, it's going to cost the party something in order to deal with these Joystealers. There is so much story packed in with the Joystealers, I personally found it a little hard to come up with only a few story ideas to tell you. But I found them. Within the slums of the city, there is a rash of people who seem off. Even for beggars, they seem to do little more than wander around, uncaring about anything or anyone. While the nobles and the government of the city probably don't care, a kindly cleric asks the party to investigate after he finds these beggars walking into the middle of dangerous situations as if nothing mattered to them. Basically, there's a lone Joystealer who just came into town and is enjoying the feast of easy victims. Like a serial killer of sorts, but without all the killing. So, I guess a serial drainer? I guess? Serial drainer. Anyway, the Joystealer could be targeting a specific type of people, which is not readily apparent since it's attacking those who are experiencing joy at eating a very specific food, a food that's given out by that kindly cleric. That's why the cleric keeps finding these victims. The Joystealer is sort of using the cleric as bait. Can the party use that against the Joystealer before it escapes to greener pastures? An Ethergaunt wants one of its former thralls returned to it and has decided to allow the party to be of service to it. An Ethergaunt with some sort of disguise magic or a useful thrall could pay to have the party hunt down one of its former Joystealers and bring it back alive. The excuse as to why could range from wanting to study how such a strange creature could exist, to figuring out how to protect against its curse, to wanting to question that specific Joystealer about something. Now, the first thing the party's going to have to figure out is, how do you catch a ghost-like creature? Then, once they deliver the Joystealer to the Ethergaunt, what does the party do when they find out they've been tricked? Do they help the Joystealer? Do they go after the Ethergaunt for revenge? Do they even care, since Joystealers aren't that great in the first place? A Joystealer remembers the old days and wishes to be freed from its current cursed state. Even more, it wants to return to the Feywild. What the Ethergaunts did to it fundamentally changed the Joystealer, but surely with magic, there's a way to undo it. Why the party would want to help the Joystealer is maybe they feel sorry for it, or perhaps the Joystealer offers to help them with a problem that they don't have another solution for. As for how they can fix it, perhaps the Ethergaunt that once enthralled the Joystealer could be slain and thus free the Joystealer from its curse. Kind of like how, the drain emotions ability of the Joystealer works. Another idea is to make a deal with a powerful fae, like an archhag with deep magic, that can override whatever horrors the Ethergaunt did to it. Which really seems like a safe idea. The party could even find a way to bind the Joystealer to the material plane, using the nature of the Fae to cause the Joystealer to change, kind of how it changed in the first place. Maybe bind it to a tree to fundamentally alter it to something kind of like a dryad. In the middle of the city, there's a prison no one has ever escaped from, despite having only a few guards and very weak security. The party gets hired to break a prisoner out, say by the local thieves guild, or maybe there's a prisoner inside they need to talk to. It's easy enough to break in, or maybe they get arrested to get in. One way or another, they get into the prison. Once inside, it looks like most of the prisoners are zombies, even though they are still alive. The story here is, the warden has made a deal with a group of Joystealers, seeing the positive side of violent prisoners being drained of all their emotions. The prisoner the party wants is one such victim. Now the party has to figure out a way to break the curse and get them out. Do they have remove curse ability, that spell ready to go? Or do they have to hunt down the Joystealer that did it in the first place? Here's a quick story idea. A Christmas-themed adventure with a Joystealer who drains a Santa-like figure. And then the party has to free Santa from this curse before it's too late and the Christmas-like festival gets canceled. It was the name that drew my attention to this monster. Joystealer. While it doesn't just go after the joy emotion, the fact that its victims gave it that name tells you the primary emotion that it's drawn to. These fae ruin joy. Yet, despite their cruelty and their joy-stealingness, the Joystealers are victims as much as the people that they drain. Eldritch horrors from another dimension essentially remade them into the horrors that they are today. Do they deserve pity? Can they be saved? Should they be saved? That's the really interesting nature of the Joystealer, and that's why I love them, and I hope you do too. In the description below, I have a link to a monster stat block for the Joystealer updated to the 2024 edition of Dungeons & Dragons, ready for you to unleash upon your players. As we are a growing channel, if you found this interesting, please leave a like and a subscribe for all our future videos. It really does mean the world. Let me thank all of you for your time and wishing you all the best until we meet again for our next monster.